Welcome, everyone. Sorry to keep you waiting out there. We started chit-chatting and having some fun. So I have David West here with me, and I'm going to do a quick introduction before I formally introduce David and Dr. Kathy Kemper-Pell. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Right, am I in presentation mode?
Yes, it looks good.
Fantastic. Okay, so welcome to today's event, Water. And I'm Sally Snyder. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the coordinator for the Diversity Programming Board here at Road Community College. Oh, wait a minute. David just told me something about this dancer. David, would you?
Yes. This young lady that you see on the screen dancing beside the lake and the marsh there, her name is Alexa Martinez, and she's from the Klamath tribes at Chiloquin, Oregon, and she's dancing beside the Klamath Lake and Klamath Marsh area. We have a Native American youth program at Southern Oregon University called Conaway Nicotilikum, and it's been in existence about 27 years, going into our 28th year collegiate preparation program. And Alexa is the first second generation student in that academy. Her mother was one of our first students when we started the academy. So I didn't recognize her until a couple of days after looking at this picture, and her family sent me some other pictures of her dancing by the lake. She just was accepted at the University of Oregon and is headed towards medical school and becoming a medical doctor.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great story. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see here. So before getting underway, I want to share our mission, which is to enrich, support, and celebrate our diverse community by acting as a catalyst for inclusion, continuous learning, understanding, and acceptance through active engagement and facilitation of educational opportunities that challenge biases and deepen conversations. And the beautiful design here, which is showing the world being held by a brown and a white hand together, was created by Camille Ireland, who is an RCC graduate. And our Diversity Programming Board offers free events throughout the year. And to see upcoming events, you can always just go to the homepage on RCC and search diversity events. And that's the easiest way to find us. If you need closed captioning, if you go to usually it's at the bottom taskbar, you'll see live transcript. And if you click on that, you can say, click on show subtitle to get those going for you. And also, if you need to raise your hand, there's reactions. This little guy here is clapping. So raise hand is how to get your hand up if you would like to ask a question, and you're also welcome to use the chat. So today is the second of 4 events honoring the 4 chiefs: fire, water, air, and land. And again, all of these events, the dates are listed here. They're going to be noon to 1:30, all via Zoom. And if you want to find them, just type in diversity events. Okay, and so now it is my pleasure to introduce David West and Dr. Kathy Kemper-Pell. And just give me a moment. There we go. Okay, so David is an enrolled member and an elder of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. He's the Director Emeritus of Native American Programs at Southern Oregon University, and he's currently retired. He has been a member of the Oregon Indian Education Association for 35 years, and he's also a member of the National Congress of American Indians. He has been selected as the Indian Educator of the Year and as the Elder of the Year in a different year by the same organization. And in 2001, a beloved dean of RCC, Tennyson Haley, established an award and named it in his honor, the David D. West 7th Generation Diversity Award. And David is the very first recipient. He is a beloved part of our community and a dear friend to many, and we're always delighted to have him lead these conversations with us. We also have Dr. Kathy Kemper-Pell, who has been serving as RCC's 6th president since 2016. However, she started her career conducting environmental research at McNeese State University and later became a professor at Lone Star College, where she taught environmental biology and student field experiences in Texas, Colorado, Arkansas, and Costa Rica. So along the way, Kathy became a forest landowner, practicing sustainable forestry on her 250-acre tree farm in Texas, and now on her 63-acre tract here in Oregon. So please join me in welcoming Kathy and David here. And now David is going to read a land acknowledgement for us.
Good afternoon. Bonjour, Nathan. Hello, my relatives. In our desire for collective healing and partnership, we offer this acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples and their connections to the land that Rogue Community College occupies. This acknowledgement was developed in conversation between Grand Ronde tribal staff, Siletz tribal staff, and Native American programs, faculty and staff at Southern Oregon University. It continues to be a living statement through this ongoing partnership. On behalf of Rogue Community College and Grandmother Agnes Baker Pilgrim, I would like to take this moment to acknowledge that Rogue Community College is located within the ancestral homelands of the Shasta, Takilma, and Latgawa peoples who have lived here since time immemorial. These tribes were displaced during rapid Euro-American colonization, the gold rush, and armed conflict between 1851 and 1856. In the 1850s, discovery of gold and settlement brought thousands of Euro-Americans to their lands, leading to warfare, epidemics, starvation, and villages being burned. In 1853, the first of several treaties were signed, confederating these tribes and others together, who would then be referred to as the Rogue River Tribe. These treaties ceded most of their homelands to the United States, and in return, they were guaranteed a permanent homeland reserved for them. At the end of the Rogue River Wars in 1856, these tribes and many other tribes from Western Oregon were removed to the Siletz Reservation and the Grand Ronde Reservation. Today, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians are living descendants of the Takilma, Shasta, and Latgawa peoples of this area. I encourage you to learn about the land that you reside on and to join us in advocating for the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous people. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm still right here. So now
Okay.
David and Kathy are going to lead us in a discussion about water. And David has some opening thoughts from Grandma Aggie.
Yes. Here in Oregon, many of the tribes have in their ceremonial practices acknowledgements to the water and to the sacredness of water. For the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Indian Reservation of Oregon, who are a longhouse people, the seven drum religion people. And before they eat, before they conduct any business, in reference to their indigeneity, there's always a small ceremony that occurs. They will make sure that every table has glasses or cups with water available. Each one is invited to pour their own water, and at a given time, everyone raises a voice in thankfulness to the water and to the mystery and the magic and the healing of the properties of water. And for the Warm Springs people, they use the term chush. For the Wasco people, they use the term ishqua. And so you may use either one of those terms whenever you would like to when you're drinking the water. And they make a recognition then to their belief as well. And Grandmother Agnes Baker Pilgrim, who I was very closely associated with and remain as a spokesperson for her family, she was quite adamant about water and the use of water as a continual part of our everyday life, and to make sure that we drank enough water to adjust the chemical balance of our bodies, mind, spirit, and emotion in total. And she told us that she wanted us to do something for her. She said, when you have a chush or an ishqua in the morning, she said, you drink that water, and when that water goes down your throat and into your body, you take the time to feel, where is that water going inside you? Where does it touch? Maybe you have not so good feeling tummy that day, or maybe you've had a cramp in your leg over the night. where does that water go immediately when you drink it first thing in the morning? And she urged us to make that one of the very first things that we did in the morning, was to have a drink of water, express our thankfulness to it in our language or a borrowed language, but to express our thankfulness to it for the life that it brings to all things, and then to feel where it's bringing life to us individually within our body. So I invite you at her invitation to do that in the morning whenever you think about it, whenever you take a drink of water. Just think how precious it is and what it brings to us every day in the existence of our being. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I always love to hear Grandma Aggie's viewpoints. She's a very wise woman.
She was.
Very wise woman. Well, we live on a water planet, and when you watch the news and you see all the space explorations going on, what is the one thing they're always looking for out amongst the stars? They're looking for water. And I guess, have you ever thought about why? Why is it they're looking for water? What is it about water that is so spectacular that is the driving force behind all of our explorations? I mean, even when you move into a new area on this planet, the first thing people look for is fresh water. We have to have it to live, but I want to challenge you today to think about it. Think about water in completely different ways. I think both of us are going to challenge you today to think a little differently about water. We all know you have to have water to survive. You have to water plants. You have to, our cells are made up of water. That's all common knowledge. But I want to challenge you to think about what makes water different from every other liquid on the planet. How is it that you can pour a glass of water and you can actually overfill the glass and have a little dome of water over the top? You can't do that with any other liquid. If you put a straw in a glass of water and put your finger on the top of the straw and pull it up, take your finger off, liquid stayed in that straw, and you can let it run out. You can't do that with any other liquid. Nothing else acts like water. When water freezes, where does it freeze? On a lake. Freezes on the top. No other liquid does that. Water freezes on top. And the reason is because water, when it freezes, it actually becomes less dense. And so it forms that layer of ice on the top of the water. Have you ever laid down on the ground underneath a tree and looked up into the branches of the tree? Now, have you ever thought, how does water get from deep in the ground through the roots all the way up this 100-foot Douglas fir up to the very tippy top of that Douglas fir? Because gravity's pulling that water back down. Water has very special properties that no other liquid has that allows it to stick to itself and to stick to the walls of the xylem tubes inside of the wood of that tree. And as that tree warms up in the daytime, it starts to sweat. It gives off, just like we do, plants sweat. They give off water and it evaporates off their leaves, and that's how they cool off, just like we do. But when a plant sweats, as the water molecules leave the surface of that plant, the water molecules that are stuck to it are drawn up into the plant, and they're all stuck together. So it's a continuous chain of water molecules from the top of the plant all the way down into the soil. Nothing else acts like that. And as a result, because water is so uniquely special in its chemical nature, it does things no other liquid can do, including sustaining our lives and the lives of everything else on this planet. And so it's a fascinating compound, if you will, to observe and to study, because there's nothing else like it. And it just does so many different things. And as a result, all life on this planet is connected to water. There is absolutely nothing alive on this planet that is not in some way contain water and have water as part of its life cycle. And I think, we talked about fire last time. The cycle of water on this planet has been interrupted because as plants give off water vapor, that water vapor goes up into the sky and it forms clouds. And when those clouds hit air of another temperature, of a cooler temperature, that rain happens. When you disrupt the plant life, you disrupt weather. And we're seeing more and more of that across our planet. It's a very, very intricate cycle. Everything is tied to water. So I think, David, I want to ask you, in the native indigenous views, when is water important? When does water become important to an individual?
I think water becomes important to individuals and to everything that lives at the time of conception, because water is the basis for the fluids within our bodies, the same as it's the fluids inside the body of the tree and of the plants and the respiration. There was an Indian gentleman from Nevada by the name of Corbin Harney, who was a medicine person who worked for many years primarily with women and primarily on female issues and breast cancer, in particular breast cancer. And he used hot springs for the restorative and curing abilities of hot springs. And when we think about Southern Oregon and the tribes that lived here, and the area around Ashland in particular, was more or less a common ground. No one really claimed occupancy there on a steady basis. They came there for the use of the many hot springs that are in the area. The sulfur that's contained in the hot springs, they found that sulfur that was emitting from the earth ended up in the mud of the hot springs. And so they would bring people who had grievous injuries or illness to the hot springs, and they would use that mud. Well, in some ways, that's almost the first sulfur drugs, because it had drying properties in the mud, as well as the antibacterial properties in the sulfur. There are many stories of the springs being used for this, and it being considered a sacred place. And so these sites were cared for and watched after. And Corbin Harney told us at a gathering of our youth academy one year that water is considered to be the strongest and most powerful of all of the medicines. The purer, cleaner the water, the stronger the medicine that it contained, that it was. And the water deserved to have caretakers and stewards. Many of the tribal people of North America believe that those sacred water sites, in particularly springs, where the water emanates from, is considered to be a sacred site. And people go there to conduct ceremonies of thanksgiving and reciprocity, and to establish a relationship between that water and the human beings, and recognition of all that that water keeps alive. For example, the Rogue River and its tributaries, many of them in the river itself, originates from a spring at the lower part of the mountain that contains Mount Mazama, that is Crater Lake. The belief was by the Tequila people and others that the river was the intestinal tract of a gigantic living being, and that as nutrients flowed into the river, it fed the land and all who lived upon the land. So as it went down to the sea, it might collect up all of the things that weren't so good. It might wash out a creek where it had been dammed up and the water behind it perhaps wasn't good. And it would clean out those streams so that the salmon could find their way home. The other beings could utilize the water better. And as it was taken out to the sea, those things would be slammed against the headlands and over and over and over again until they were reduced to their basic element and joined the parade of the clouds inland, gathering up the respiration of the trees that Kathy just talked about. And when the rain fell into Crater Lake, was seen as the mouth of the gigantic living being. And that includes the entire Klamath knot that was affected by the water from Crater Lake, Mount Mazama. And so when the river was full of fish and other aquatic beings, it was said that the table was set. So the water was a component of our survival, all things survival, and reciprocity and replenishment. Salmon come, the bears capture the salmon. They eat the salmon, the parts that they want, they drag the rest off up into the woods and it becomes fertilizer. As it breaks down in the water, it feeds the small aquatic animals that grow strong and grow healthy, that then in turn feed the salmon smolt as they travel down river to the sea. One of the things that grandmother taught us about how important is the water, it is for those salmon, of course, but it's also at the time of their being because they're fed from the water. And I didn't know until a couple of years ago when I was talking to a fisheries biologist for the state about the outcomes of the salmon ceremonies that Grandmother Aggie reinstituted on both the Applegate and the Rogue Rivers in relationship to the first salmon ceremonies. I didn't know until that time that salmon go down river backwards. They don't go down nose first, they go down backwards. So as they're going, food comes down the river and flows into them. All they have to do is open their mouths and eat it. But they also scent the water from the stream that they were born in and down to the river that they flow into, like the Rogue, say the Applegate into the Rogue, so that when they're coming back upstream on their migration to spawn, they stop and would mill around just below the mouths of the feeder streams. And the Indian people at that time, I was told, didn't fish for them when they would be stopped there milling around, because what they were doing was scenting that water to know if that was the stream they were supposed to go back on to go to their spawning ground. And so once they had decided and moved a certain distance up the feeder stream and the main rest of the body of the fish had moved on up the river to the next feeder stream, that's when they would begin to fish for them. And that's how they knew how to get back to where they had been birthed. That's how they make it back there. I'd wondered and wondered and wondered, how do they know where to go for all of my life? And now I know by that explanation. So water is important right from the very beginning. And for many of our Indian peoples, my tribes, I'm Potawatomi, Miami, and Kickapoo from the Great Lakes area. I was born and raised here in Oregon, and I've been making my journeys back to the Great Lakes and to the homelands of my own people. And I find out so very much about how important water is. because of the Great Lakes and the food that was there for the people and the ceremonies that are conducted there all the time, year round, in relationship to keeping a good relationship with our food. And the cleaner, the purer the water, the more effective the medicine. It's the same there as it is here. And there are people that go to take care of the waters. And before any ceremonies, before anything is conducted back there, and I find very similar kinds of ways amongst the people here, the women address the water and give thanks for the water in all things. And for us males, the uncles have an obligation, they have a duty that I was taught by my grandfather, that when babies come into the world, that an uncle is often invited to hold them and pray with them, sing to them, welcome them to the world, but also to rub the bottom of their feet so that this helps them to make transformation from the water world to the land walking, air breathing world. And I found from Grandma Aggie that her family had very much the similar kind of feeling about it. Because when you walk on the earth, you touch the earth, you are tapping into the electromagnetic field of Mother Earth, her life essence. And that when you put your hands together in such a fashion, you match up the lines in your hands, you're standing on the bare earth, you form an electrical connection, an electrical current with your body plugged into the Mother Earth. And it's restorative and balancing and very productive for healthful relationship. So this is an important relationship for the uncles to help with this. And Grandma used to say all the time, we're transformational beings. We start out as water babies and then we become air breathing, land walking babies. And so those are just some of the connections. There are many, many, many more, but that's some of the ones that are really prominent.
You know, you mentioned the Rogue River as being part of the intestinal tract of a large organism. And I'm always fascinated by that analogy because there's a whole branch of ecology called organismal ecology. And it really focuses on, for lack of a better phrase, seeing the big picture and understanding our planet as one giant organism, that every ecosystem really depends on other ecosystems on the planet. Everything is interrelated, and those ecosystems are, for instance, the obvious one is the rainforest ecosystems of South America, and the impact they have on generating oxygen for our atmosphere and for generating rainfall, and cycling water, but they impact planetary weather patterns, not just the weather patterns over the rainforests. And I had an opportunity to study under an organismal ecologist, and it was really fascinating to not just look at a very small area and look at the interrelationships, but to take it globally. I'm sure some of you saw recently that E.O. Wilson passed away. And I would describe him as an organismal ecologist. He saw the planet as a giant being with lots of different organ systems within it, and made huge contributions to the study of ecology. He would be a good person to check out on the scientific side to see what kind of work was done. But there's just so much that that we take for granted and assume will always be here. And I think just recently we've started to awaken to the idea that maybe water is not something we should take for granted. I started teaching environmental biology in 1993, and we knew then that global warming was a problem. We knew then that there were places around the world where water was coming into very short supply, and that water needed to be conserved and treated as a valuable resource. And 1993 was almost 30 years ago. And we knew all of that then, and we're still not quite awakened as a Western society to the dangers of interfering with the water cycle and ensuring that life on this planet as we know it can continue. I'd be curious to know from you, David, what kinds of, what other water ceremonies are around water preservation. I know we talked about, the honorable harvest applying to plants and to animals, but, is there a way to apply the honorable harvest to water?
Well, yes, I think there is. For my people, it was the gathering of wild rice, manaman, around the Great Lakes. It was a primary water food. It's a grass. It's not really rice. It's grass, and it's harvested each year in the fall time, and it's harvested in canoes. And the harvesters, there's one paddler and a gatherer, and there are other names for them and designations, but those are the ones I know. And they have two. The gatherer is a person that has two sticks, and they gather. The wild rice grows tall in the waters in the estuaries and the slow places in the lakes. And they pull the head of the rice over the canoe, and they clap the sticks together. And this causes the rice to jump out of the stalks and land in the bottom of the canoe, where it's on a blanket or a robe or a tarp. And any that goes over the side, jumps off, hits the gunnel of the canoe and falls off into the water is a blessing, because that's the next round. They're replanting as they're gathering. That seed falls back into the lake so that we don't take everything, and which follows a lot of our traditional teachings about when you go to gather food, you don't take all of what's there. You take what you need, and you give thanks for it before you pick it. In many places, we're taught that before you gather anything, like gathering sage or cedar for ceremonials, or wangasik, sweetgrass, Mother Earth's hair, tobacco, harvesting wild tobacco, the inner bark of the willow tree. Before you take any of those things for our food and medicine ceremonial usage, you have to approach the largest plant, and you're supposed to put down a gift. For us, it was masema, or tobacco. And this was one of the ways that we used tobacco in a completely different way than we use tobacco today. It was used as a medium of message. And there's a long story that goes along with that, about it being a gift of a life, a sacred life, that tobacco plant. And so we use tobacco to make those recognitions. And we approach the largest plant because that's seen as the grandmother. And you ask permission of the grandmother to gather what you might need from her children, her grandchildren, and not to take all from one plant so that you hurt it, not to take anything that you have to force and rip off of a limb of cedar bough. One that just comes off in your hand is the one that it's giving you. If you try to force it, it'll fight you, and even cedar will stick you with those little pitchfork ends of the needle. And if you've ever been poked by cedar really hard, where it's been agitated and the juice, the sap comes up to the surface, it's like a little tiny poison arrow. Ding! Boy, it'll get you and it will hurt for a long time after that. Cedar has its own protection forces about it. So you don't take everything. And if you can't use all that you've taken, then it becomes incumbent upon you that you gift it to someone else that may have need for it, so that you don't have to throw it away and then in essence have wasted a gift of a life. Because when we take that off, we're taking the life of that particular branch of that tree. You're taking a life. If you pull a blackberry off of the blackberry vine and you eat that, you just killed that little berry. And that little berry, those little wonderful, excuse me, Pavlov had a really good theory. When you take that blackberry, that grandmother of all blackberries, just vibing with wonderfulness and juice and all that stuff. You take that bite of that and it just, what did you just do when you pulled it off of that limb? You took a life. Because that, and you took many lives, because that berry, those are cotyledons, I believe is the term. They're babies. That's the next generation that you just took off of that berry plant to give yourself life. You wash it down with water. The juice that's in the plant is water that gives it the life, and it comes back to you as water through the sweetness of the juice and the gift of the plant. And we're not supposed to waste that life. You take good care of it, it becomes an honorable, reciprocity-based relationship. And it becomes just an inherent part of your living, your nourishment, the things that that help to sustain us. I think about these things often, about prophecies amongst the native people that said at some point in our future, after the coming of the new people, that water would be worth more than the yellow rock for which they sought and destroyed so much, that water would become more valuable than that yellow rock. And when I look at the way things are right now, Kathy, you were just mentioning that you've been on up to Hyatt Lake and going skiing up there, cross-country skiing, and it was only 5% of water in Hyatt Lake. That's one of the main irrigation sources for the southern end of the valley, and all of those orchards, the vineyards, the pot farms, all of those things that are sucking up so much water. And then we have, that leads to a question, and I can't see all of you, so I'll just ask in sequence here. How many of you, if you were able to raise your hand where I could see it, how many of you would run down to the Rogue River and have a great big old drink out of the Rogue River, anywhere on the Rogue River? Probably not too many. How about the Applegate? Yeah, maybe, but we're going to be kind of sick probably because the water's low in that lake, and Carberry Creek and Thompson Creek both have heavy amounts of mercury and cyanide and arsenic that are from mining disturbance. So we probably wouldn't want to take a big drink out of the Applegate, particularly out of the lake. So let's see, how about Bear Creek? When you run down and have a big drink out of Bear Creek? I don't think I'd see many hands there. How about the Illinois? Maybe above Tacoma, but maybe not. Big drink out of Howard Prairie. Probably not too many. Big drink out of Hyatt Lake, Little Hyatt Lake. Right now, probably not too many. I think I would probably take a drink in some places out of Lake of the Woods or Diamond Lake, possibly. But what does that say in all those major bodies of water that we can't drink the water? We can't just run down there and have a drink out of the water because it's got effluents in it. It's got poison in it. What are we doing? Poisoning the greatest of all medicines. It's something to consider and something to think about. I just lost my water pump and my water tank starting last Friday. So it had to be an emergency repair, but it took until Sunday. And so 3 days without water makes one reestablish the importance and the connection to water, in particular hot water. Cold showers at this time of the year are not really too much fun. So how important is that water? It's so important to us every day. Know that I know people and families that are caring for loved ones that are very ill. And it's come to the point for many of them that they can't take any nourishment into their bodies other than water. So at the beginning and also at the life ending of the cycle, the life cycle that everything follows, that water is important on both ends of that life and all the way through.
Now, in my introduction, Sally mentioned that I used to take students out on these field experiences. And one of those was a wilderness canoeing trip down the Buffalo River in Arkansas. And the river was our water source. And students had to learn how to filter that water and, boil that water and prepare it for consumption before they could do anything with it. And it was very interesting because some of my students wanted to fish and they wanted to eat the fish that they caught. Well, first of all, I'm teaching environmental biology. Nobody has a fishing license, which I didn't want us to get in trouble for. But part of the reason for those fishing licenses is to familiarize people with the game regulations of the area. And one of the game regulations was on the Buffalo River, it's catch and release only. And my students were confused because they didn't understand why they couldn't keep these fish and eat them. And I said, there's too much arsenic in the water. I said, wait a minute, we've been drinking that water. You let us drink water with arsenic in it? And I had to explain to them that, what organisms do is as they eat other organisms that live in the water, the further up the food chain you are, the more concentrated poisons become. So the poison that's in the water itself is fairly dilute. But as small organisms live in that water, they absorb some of that arsenic, and then other animals eat them. And at each level in the food chain, that arsenic gets more concentrated. So by the time you get to a fairly good sized fish, it's far enough up on the food chain that it has concentrated a lot of arsenic in its tissues, and it's no longer edible. And it was okay for us to filter and drink the water, but it was definitely not okay for us to be eating fish from that very same water.
That's the same thing that they tell us about fishing in the lakes, the different lakes. There's when there's enough water in them that you can fish in them, you can't eat more than 1 or 2 fish a week of most of the lakes because of the high content of those harmful minerals.
Yes.
That's concerning because not only is that for human beings, that's for everything that drinks out of that lake.
Absolutely.
It doesn't just, we're not the only ones that it affects. It affects everything. And it affects the plant life, the birds, the crawlers, the swimmers.
Imagine a bear at the top of the food chain.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And eagles, hawks, osprey, our own mascot, what they're eating oftentimes is not that good for them, particularly where a few years ago we were having a lot of salmon coming up the river in and around Grants Pass that had huge tumors on them, like they were burnt places on them almost. And it had to do with arsenic and what they had swam through on their way up here. And we don't really think about the water being in the wild and scenic area of the river from Graves Creek down, that there's that much inflow of toxicity. The toxicity happens above the wild and scenic area, but look how it impacts
Right.
the wild and scenic area that has been designated for us to keep in a pristine manner. And how can that be when the water that feeds a large portion of that, because it's not just the road. There's the other rivers that like the Chetco that are on the other side of the mountain range and still are affected almost from their headwaters from old mining in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And those things are still in the food source, so they flow down and out into the ocean. It has impact from all the way down to the little shrimps to the biggest whales.
And mining is a pretty big, easily recognized, source of pollution, and a major one here because there was so much mining. But there are agricultural pollutants that wind up in water, chemicals that we use to help boost the growth of plant life in agricultural areas, do that in water as well, and can create algal blooms that can create toxic conditions in our waterways. It's a big problem because when those algae, if they die suddenly, all of them at once, the decomposition of those algae takes up all the oxygen in the water, and the fish have no oxygen. So it can really disrupt an ecosystem. Any kind of sewage that is not being treated before it's released into our waterways creates, it's called eutrophication of the water. And it just means that there's too many nutrients and too many bacteria in the water for it to be healthy. And it upsets the balance of that ecosystem. Can be very devastating. What we pour into storm sewers, or what we allow to run into storm sewers, that eventually winds up in our waterways.
Isn't that part of what you're talking about, the runoff from agriculture and different things? Wasn't that part of the main contributing factors into the huge salmon die-off in the Klamath River a couple of years ago because of the algae,
Yes.
the green
Yes.
algae content?
Yeah, that was exactly what happened. A huge bloom of algae. And some algae actually produce toxins too, neurotoxins that can poison the fish even before there's oxygen deprivation.
Once again, the animals can't drink out of that lake or that
That's
river
right.
when that toxic bloom is happening, because it can kill them too. So,
Absolutely.
mhm.
Absolutely. Now, 75% of our planet is covered with water, our oceans. And a lot of people don't realize that it's the algae growing in the top 3 meters of the ocean that produce most of the oxygen on our planet.
I was not aware of that. Thank you.
That is, yeah. Oh, I see somebody posted about the manatees. Yes, it is. That's a great example of a really unfortunate habitat problem where the manatees are suffering from a result of the eutrophication of the water.
But did you hear the new issue where they've been going to the outlet of the nuclear power plants for so long to stay warm in wintertime that they've lost the ability to stay warm and now are facing a new die-off because of the colder waters in winter?
Yes, I follow manatees pretty closely. They're one of my favorite animals. There's a picture of me in my office, in one of my offices with a manatee, and in my other office, there's a picture of me with a beluga whale. Yeah, manatees are, in fact, I've actually kayaked with some biologists in Florida near that power plant to look at those manatees gathering in that warm water area. And there's been some concern for quite a long time that they stopped migrating. And we're just hovering in that same area all the time. Animals adapt. They adapt to whatever conditions happen to be around. But this particular adaptation is not in their best interest long term. Sometimes we humans do that too. We develop behaviors out of habit that are not always good for us. And that's exactly what these manatees are doing.
Especially with them shutting down these old reactors and having no plans to bring them back on. It's going to leave the poor guys stranded.
Yep. It is a big problem. Along our coastal waters, we see more and more red tides happening. And red tides are usually just offshore near the mouth of a river. And the nutrients that are being carried by the rivers into the ocean support the growth of these particular type of algae that, when they're in low numbers, aren't a big problem, but when they bloom and they're in very, very high numbers, they produce a neurotoxin that kills off all the fish in the region. And then these fish wash up on the beach. And so in Florida, for instance, and I know they do it in Hawaii too, is they have helicopters patrolling the beach lines, watching for red tides, trying to catch them before they get too far along. And they can restrict fishing in those areas. And they're trying to develop some mechanisms for dispersing those microscopic organisms so that they're not so concentrated in one place and creating all those toxins in one place. Water creates major challenges for biologists because we're not water creatures. For us landlubbers who have to do everything by a boat, or I've worked in areas where you would think, yeah, let's put on some scuba gear and go do this research. Well, you can't see your hand in front of your face because the water's so murky, and you can't function and collect samples and do things very effectively in those kind of conditions. So water can present some interesting challenges in trying to learn more about those ecosystems.
I think that's one of the interesting things that I was asked a question about. Did I know about the stone chair on the Rogue River where grandmother held her salmon ceremonies, first salmon ceremonies on the Rogue at what has now been renamed its original name, Tillamook Falls, just outside of Gold Hill. And yes, I'm very well aware of the chair and of the fact that at 80 plus years old, Grandma Aggie, who was crippled in her right leg, was loaded up, fitted up with some water gear and some really good flotation devices and a whole bunch of river guides that loaded her on, I don't know whether it was a canoe or a kayak, a torpedo. And they brought her down the river to this chair that's in the river. There's a placard noting it there just at the falls, that and a wayside there that you can pull up on the side road would be on the east side of the Rogue River Bridge at you go underneath the railroad tracks right there at Gold Hill and follow it up, and you'll come to it, be on the left-hand side about 1.75 miles up the road. The belief and the understanding is, the knowledge is that the chief of the Takelmas would, they would be aware of when the salmon were going to start running, because the starlings would come up the river and flocks, and the people would see them, and they knew that the fish were on their way within the next couple of days when the starlings came up the river in mass. And so they would go to this location, and there is indeed a stone chair in the river, and it's shaped just like a chair. And they would catch the first salmon, and then that salmon would be used to cook, be cooked, and to feed all the people that were gathered there. Everybody had to have a piece of the first salmon. And then there would be 4 young men that would be chosen, that they would gather up all of the bones and everything from the salmon, and would be placed on cedar boughs, and some placed in their mouths. And these young men would have to prepare themselves for 6 months to 1 year to perform this ceremony. And they would put these bones in their mouth, back bones mostly. And at a given point, they would dive into the river and go to the bottom of the river and let go of the cedar boughs underneath the water as far as they could get to the close they could get to the bottom. At that point, they'd spit out the bones that they had in their mouth, and then they would come back up to the surface. And the belief was that if the offering was pure, the gift was pure, was clean and good and of a good heart, that it would go down to the salmon people who were walking on the bottom of the river. And if they accepted the gift and the recognition, they would turn themselves into the salmon to come back up to the surface so that the people could net them or spear them for their food. And they would regenerate, that the salmon would then regenerate. And for all of the years that she did those ceremonies, 18 years on the Applegate and the Rogue, all of those years, the salmon runs were good. And during that period of time, usually right around the very first ones that she ever did, would be the highest salmon runs recorded on the rivers since they began recording the runs on the rivers. The Applegate in particular, the fisheries biologists were absolutely blown away and had no concept of any other thing to offer about why this salmon run was so huge that particular years, because that year, because there was 10 years before that, and more, that they had been recording these runs where the runs were pretty low. And the first year that Aggie did her salmon ceremony was the largest one they'd ever recorded. They didn't have any answer for that, but we did. It was the ceremony. It was a spiritual recognition and reciprocity. And also, we believe that grandmother, because she drank that water, she ate of that first salmon, she did the blessings over the first salmon, the blessings of the land, that it created something for her in the way of having the right words that would come to represent the water, to replace the people's feeling of what they needed to have and how to bless those things in the drinking of the water. They would have good words to advocate for its defense and protection, to keep it clean. If you bring in something to the camp for the salmon ceremony, you don't leave it there. You take it out. No cigarette butts on the ground, no cigarette butts in the fire, the ceremonial fire. If you have to smoke tobacco, you might want to think about smoking it in a ceremonial way at these gatherings and these such. She was very adamant about that. So that when we left, wherever the campgrounds was established, when we left there after the ceremonies were over, it had to be better than when we arrived. Nobody could go home until it passed Grandma's inspection. that it was clean and it was good, because she said the trees, the water, the land, the air would all remember how it was that we had treated it. And one day, because we were thankful to those things and to that food and that life, that one day we might be walking along or sitting out there in a quiet time, and we might actually hear the forest and the river and the land and the beings say back to us, thank you. I believe that to be true. That's true reciprocity. And that has to be done with a good heart.
Yeah, I really like that, David, because I think that Western culture has really viewed natural resources as something to be, tools for man, things that we should use. And we don't give thanks before we use them. And we often don't use them carefully, thoughtfully, and with reciprocity in mind. And yes, this planet will exist with or without us. I firmly believe that. And I know it's true because it existed long before we did. And, it will exist long after us. And, if humans want to continue their existence on this earth and hand it down to future generations, we have to have Grandma Aggie's attitude if we want to hand it down in better shape than we received it. And that's a big challenge. That is a big challenge right now to help people embrace the idea that Indigenous peoples have always seen the earth as a blessing and gifts. And I would love to see Western civilization really adopt that mindset that natural resources are gifts, not to be taken for granted, and to be cared for well and passed on to future generations. We have obligations we're not living up to.
Yes, we are. And I think that's really one of the things that's really on my mind an awful lot in these days. We're kind of preoccupied with protecting our space that we live in, our home space, my 40 acres, my family's couple of acres, or an apartment in downtown Eugene, that we don't think about the totality of the environment and what an amazing planet this is. I was really impressed with what William Shatner had to say after his ride into space, and coming back after that. And he talked very much about the beauty of the earth and that she needed to be cared for. And he was deeply touched. You could tell he was deeply, deeply moved, clear to his soul. What does it take for us to be that moved to take action? Does our whole town and everybody's home within it have to burn all at one time? The fire was selective in certain areas. It would burn everything all around one house, one chicken coop standing out all by itself, everything else reduced to cinders, metal melted into piles, and that one building stood there. Why is that? How is that so? When you go into areas that have been ravaged by the wildfires and burning way hotter than historical wildfires, to the point of melting rocks, that's super intense heat.
And you bring up an amazing point. What do we rely on to control fire?
Water.
Absolutely. We rely on water to prevent it by creating healthy ecosystems. And when it happens, we rely on water to put it out. one way or another.
So I
It's
was just trying to find this. A friend of mine sent me a notice or something that's coming up here. I was going to see if Sally could look for it and see it. We have an opportunity. There's a Vesper Meadows is here in Southern Oregon, and it's really such a neat thing that is coming up. Next month, there's an author, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is the author of 2 of our suggested reading books that are on the list here. And she's going to be doing a talk through the Jackson County Library System on the efforts at Vesper Meadows and what has been going on there. So I don't know if you.
I put in the website.
Okay,
Yep,
she's
and
got
I'll
it.
share the screen here.
I think this is so exciting because this lady is my tribal member from the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And I saw her for the first time at the Indigenous Forum of the Pioneers Conference in San Rafael, California. And the huge number of people that were there talking about working together for the survival of the planet and for that stewardship and interconnectedness and interreliability of all things. What you got, Kathy?
Oh, I just have to reiterate, I think Robin Wall Kimmerer is my sister by a different mother. She's a biologist. She's Indigenous person, and the title of the book, Braiding Sweetgrass, to me has so many meanings because she really does weave Western scientific knowledge and Indigenous knowledge into this beautiful and poetic story. And is without a doubt the most captivating book that I have read in my adult life. I just love her writing. And I'm super excited that there's going to be an event involving her through our library system. This is really exciting.
Yes, it is for me too. When I saw her, there was probably, I bet there was 4,500 people in the auditorium. And the entire time of her presentation, you could have heard a pin drop in that big auditorium. And when she was done, the standing ovation went on and on and on. The richness of her humor, how she was able to tie that into presentations that had gone just before, and telling people were identifying the areas that needed help, where the planet was in trouble and good stewardship wasn't happening, and what were they to do about it? Where were you going to put these things to go back to the earth? And she said, we have a place where you can put them back in good ways, where you've taken care of them and made sure that they are able to return. It's called the forest. The forest will take them back and in some way make them better again. Mother Earth has amazing restorative abilities, but she has to be helped. She can't be slammed from 4 different directions and expected to come back. I think one thing that humans, our concept of time is pretty fleeting, given the lifeline of the planet. We don't live very long, not nearly as long as rocks. Or sequoias or redwoods or cedars. Many of them live way longer than we do. So how do you respect your elders? Your elders not only amongst the 2-legged, the human beings, but the elders amongst everything else that lives, the flyers, the swimmers, the crawlers, all of them, the 1-legged, the food and medicine of Mother Earth, the mosses. How ancient is moss? What does it give us? There's so much food, there's so much medicine that in our hurry to live time to its fullest, we've ran right past the things that we only see if we slow down long enough to see. I think we need to return to that. We have a serious disconnect from nature, and hopefully that's going to return to us in some kind of good way, where we reestablish that connection between ourselves and with the hope for the 7 generations ahead of us, and beyond that, and in respect to the 7 generations immediately behind us and those beyond that, with our respect. This has been a good presentation today. Thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate working with you and offering these good things that have been given to us to pass on. I was told when I graduated from college and was preparing to come back to Oregon by my Tlingit relatives who had adopted me in Alaska. They danced a dance of preparation around my family and I to come back home. And the elder man who was leading the dance, and when he finished, he took his mask off and his sea lion whisker gloves off, and he walked right up to my face and he said, we love you and your family, and we want you to go home now. You're going to be like the wolf. You're going to be the long runner that carries the news to the people and the teaching to the people. You're a teacher now. And what you've been taught, you don't own. You don't have a right to keep. You have to teach it because it doesn't belong to you. It was handed down to you, and you have to hand it on down to those after. And so I'm trying to honor that direction, even in my retirement. And this is some of the funner times of preparing these kinds of things is in my retirement, because I'm not so constrained by timelines. I'm closer to natural timelines, and I like that for doing this preparation. But I really do appreciate this, Kathy, and for all of you that tune in and listen to us. I hope what we're giving you is helpful and that it touches you in a way that you can utilize for the well-being of ourselves and our relatives. Thank you so much.
I just want to reiterate how much I appreciate your attendance, David, your insights. This has been it's always a joy for me to do this with you. I completely enjoy it. I wish we were actually sitting on the rim of Crater Lake doing this. We talked earlier about how special Crater Lake is. And, you know, it's close to us. And this is one of the most remarkable bodies of water in the world. And it's if you don't spend time there, I encourage you to do so. There is, the properties of the water in this lake are very unique and special. And I encourage you to really soak in that beauty and help just let that permeate every cell of your being so that you can be a teacher too. We all need to be sharing this.
Thank you.
This color is in honor of water, by the way.
I like it.
Yes.
Good job.
Very much, David and Kathy, for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge with us. I hope that we all can go forth being really good caretakers, especially of water, giving it thanks, of our land, caretakers of our air, caretakers of our fire. And David, you mentioned our disconnect. And on the drive in this morning, I was listening to NPR and they were talking about mental health and recognizing that as just as important as your physical health. And we tend to be disconnected from our mind and body. I think about this, how we look at it like they're separate things. And so I think the starting place for me is connecting my mind and my body as one. And then my connection to you, my connection to anything around me, to the earth, to each other. We need to repair, we need to heal those connections and interrelatedness. So looks like we do have a question. Kay Nielsen. if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I so appreciate this topic and find it so important. I live in Selma. It has become water wars out here because of the illegal marijuana, and I really, I have learned a lot, and I've also learned a lot by getting involved in our local watershed councils. And I really hope that people can also do that, learn more about your local watershed councils and what you can do on the local level to help save our waters. It's just, it's really important as what was stated today. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great information.
Yes. There's a lady named De La Peña, who is from the Chumash people, I believe, in Southern California. I hope I've got her tribe right. But she shared something at the Pioneers Conference one year, and she now has a doctorate in ecological biology as well. She was telling us that when she was a little girl, her grandmothers recognized that she had the gifts and the abilities of some of her ancestors, in particular, some of the medicine women of her people. She may be Pomo. And I'm sorry that I don't recollect just exactly which tribe, but she is indigenous. She said that she started out with her elders taking her to the headwaters of their water systems. And she had to walk that entire water system in her early years, and they'd have her walk a certain distance every day. And she thought that she was alone every day until late in the afternoon, where she would come to the place they said they would meet, until she'd been at it a while. And then she realized that her aunties and her grandmothers were up on the ridges following her down the watershed as she was going down. But they made her follow the water from the beginning of the watershed, from the spring coming out of the side of the mountain, all the way down through the cities, through everything, all the way to her house and into her house and to the kitchen, where she turned on the tap and ran the water that she had followed from its source to her glass for her water, for her drink. And she taught that in turn to her children. And she said, if you really want to know how important water is, go to the source of the water that you drink in your home and trace it to your house. Go the entire distance and see what it has to go through on its journey to you. And remember that when it gets back to the sea and it comes back with the clouds to feed the gigantic living being, that this is repeating a process that perhaps our ancestors all over the world, in this same process, we're drinking the same water that's regenerated itself that our ancestors drank very long ago.
All right, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Appreciate all of you being here as well. And our next event is going to be on air in a month on February 24th. You'll be seeing flyers for that soon. And then again in May, we have the final one on land, May 20. I didn't write it down, but it's in May. All right. I hope you all have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Miigwech. Bye, Kathy. See ya.
Bye. A pleasure once again.
Yes, ma'am.